Hello, thank you for joining me for this provocation. My name is Rowena Arshad, and I guess I've been asked to take part in this because of my area of work of inequality, social inclusion, anti-discriminatory practice. I've titled my talk A Sense of Fairness, Intuition and Common Sense is Not Enough. Regardless of the philosophical backgrounds we come from, whether that is from the West or from Confucian backgrounds or African or indigenous, it would appear that there's a range of values and positions that we all agree are important. Truthfulness, respect, fairness, being moral, doing right, and so on and so forth. And they seem to be global. But in relation to social justice, delivering for inclusion, being respectful of diversity, many of us turn each day, I think, to something that I have called the internal governor. Some of you might have called it the moral compass. And we use this internal governor to assist us to make sense of our everyday issues, of the dilemmas we face, of making decisions about critical ethical situations, and the competing demands that face us on a daily basis. And in terms of equality and social justice, for example, we might use the internal governor to sift out internal prejudices that we might have so that we don't act out these prejudices. And so we behave in a way that is ethical, logical, thoughtful, and compassionate as we work. And some might say that this internal governor or moral compass is linked to what we would call our intuition or common sense. And Andy Hargrave talks about the fact that teachers, and I know it's dating back to 1981, but he said teachers draw on common sense rather than any theoretical framework. Now, given the push for professional learning and professional updates in recent years, perhaps this is no longer the case, and we're much more informed about why we do certain things. But at the same time, I don't think we can completely, in the hustle and bustle of everyday life, say that we always draw on our theoretical frameworks. I do think we go back to intuition and common sense and draw from those. Now, Mary Jalango and her colleagues say that outstanding teachers draw a great deal, in fact, from intuition. However, if we are to make a difference for equity, inclusion, and justice, and wish to engage in transformative education, then I would say it's not sufficient to rely on intuition or common sense. This is particularly so we're talking about developing rapport, empathy, understanding, to enable us to engage in a practice that's culturally relevant or anti-discriminatory. Unless we have had the opportunities to experience diversity, diverse contexts, engage with interpreting things from a range of perspectives, any intuition we will hone will largely draw from our own cultural understandings of the world. Now, given Scotland's teaching workforce remains largely homogenous, any such intuition is likely to draw from similar rather than diverse sources. Which brings me to my first provocation, which is to meet the needs of the diversity of learners in our classrooms and to ensure education has a transformative impact. Examining issues of positionality needs to be part of our personal and professional ethical framework. In the GTCS annual lecture of 2022, Dr. Van Newland opened her talk by acknowledging the traditional territories of First Nation peoples of the geographic area she was speaking from. In that sense, it was a part of Ontario, Canada. Now, this is routine in many Canadian meetings, conferences, and presentations, the acknowledging of territories, showing respect and recognition to Aboriginal peoples. It's a practice that also has happened in other places, such as in New Zealand, acknowledging Maori lands and heritage. This is a tradition that has dated back a long time for many Aboriginal Indigenous peoples, in terms of acknowledging place as a source of identity. But for speakers who do not come from those backgrounds, but come perhaps from settler communities or pre-colonial communities, the opportunity to acknowledge history and context is actually also a way of acknowledging our own positionality within that context. So what do I mean when I use the term positionality? And why is this important? First of all, we're multidimensional. We have different characteristics such as age and gender, color of our skin, our ethnicity, our social class, our abilities, our gender identities, and so on. And these interact, and they interact in a way that helps us understand the world and can influence our behavior and practice. Some of these characteristics will have more status than others, and at different times, these characteristics will offer, different contexts will offer us different interpretations. So, for example, and perhaps even within a world that is much more conscious about issues of sexual orientation, I would suggest to you that a man and woman with a couple wanting to hold hands in public probably just does so without much thought. I'm just turning down the heater there. Without much thought. But a gay couple wishing to do the same will have to work out for themselves if this is a safe space or moment to be doing so or not. The gay couple will be aware of societal views of discrimination, potential discrimination, abuse, even physical danger. All the issues that a straight couple are unlikely to have had to consider. When I was looking for accommodation in Edinburgh to stay many years ago, I was mindful of the kind of area I was looking for. And for right or wrong, there were certain areas that I considered would place me and my family at higher risk of racism or racial harassment. When I was relating this to my white colleagues, they were amazed, but also disbelieving of the need to do so. Their experience of the everyday had not required them to consider issues of safety or acceptability of where they lived on grounds of the color of their skin. Factors of safety, proximity to schools, access to public transport and shopping might well have been considerations they were familiar with. But the issue of the color of the skin was something they hadn't thought about. So when I mentioned this to them, this was a new perspective they had not previously considered. So our life experiences shape who we are and the experiences we have. Now, these experiences are temporal and multiple, but for us to engage ethically in culturally relevant pedagogies, or indeed inclusive pedagogies, and to take forward, proactively take forward equality, justice, and anti-discrimination, I would suggest that we must begin by understanding ourselves, our context, our positionality in life, and how these have shaped our values, our interpretation of situations, and by extension, our practice. This must mean that we must have the ethical maturity as professionals, not to take an ostrich-like approach to hardcore issues, such as discussing whiteness or heteronormative or class privilege, and not to move into defensive mode if we do not agree or like what we hear. You will have heard of the term white fragility, a term coined by white US academic Robin DiAngelo. She refers to this as discomfort or defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racism or racial injustice. But there are also other ways we can become defensive, having heteronormative fragility, for example, on the part of people who are straight when confronted with issues of sexual orientation, homophobia, and so forth. So I think it is our ethical responsibility to engage in constructive debates and discussions, but we must also develop what I would say is social justice stamina as part of our ethical framework, so that we do not live in bubbles insulated by our positionality, particularly if it's a privileged positionality. In a workforce that is not diverse, or not as diverse as we would like it to be, particularly in the area of color, language, class, disability, gender identity, and so on, I think it is even more important that those teachers, those of us in majority groups, take responsibility to consider our positionality and how this impacts on how we understand our pupils' lives, the communities and families they come from. This may be an uncomfortable process and not a safe place to go, but it is part of our professional competence and meeting of professional standards. More recently, some of you will have known that I chaired the Diversify the Teaching Profession Working Group for the Scottish Government. My colleagues and I in that working group asked the General Teaching Council in Scotland in their review of professional standards to ask how initial teacher education providers were providing opportunities for future teachers to consider issues of positionality. So in 2020, we wrote to the GTCS and said, given the lack of diversity currently within the teaching profession or some protected characteristics, can you let us know how you're enabling student teachers to acknowledge and consider how their positionality and identity shapes their thinking and practice? The rationale behind that is that whilst we would love to diversify the teaching profession, it is a slow and long-term goal. In the main, therefore, we will be educating and training more white teachers. So in the area of race and color and ethnicity, we were very keen for white teachers of tomorrow to become far more confident about issues of racism, about discussing them, about tackling them in the classroom. And so actually engaging with the positionality of those teachers was really, really crucial. We also suggested that we were able to ask this accreditation panel sessions, and assuming there's somebody in the accreditation panel group that can actually engage with any response in a critical, informed and robust way, then we would be the first of Europe to do this, possibly the world. And it would place us ahead of the curve in the area of teacher professionalism, in the area of equity and social justice. The response from the GTCS in 2020, March, was that they would ensure that during support meetings and at accreditation events in the future, this question would be asked. I do hope that that is the case. Being prepared to seriously reflect on your own positionality requires what Kathy Heighton talks about as reflective humility. Kathy Heighton's Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of North Carolina, and she suggests that ongoing self-reflection is an important part of good character. So if we're suggesting that being ethical is something to do with being moral, being good, then self-reflection of our positionality, of how this impacts and how we understand the world and the situations that we find ourselves in at the micro level in the classroom is really important. But she says that to actually be able to have reflective humility, this requires a special kind of listening and a preparedness to expose our vulnerabilities sufficiently. And I love this next quote, drawing from Lisa Delpit's work, to expose our vulnerabilities sufficiently enough to allow our world to turn upside down in order to allow the realities of others to edge themselves into our consciousness. And I absolutely love this, because I think that for me is the crux of it. It's this walking in somebody else's moccasin for more than a day and really, really listening, really empathizing. Unfortunately, I have to say to you, with over 30 years of working with teachers in this area, I still have met teachers not prepared to engage in reflective humility, dismissing things like social justice as laudable, but not really practical, and disbelieving of issues of racism and homophobia and other forms of inequalities, and displaying unfortunate levels of arrogance. Moving on then to Provocation 2. Education for transformation at a time of chaos requires teachers to be prepared to have political nous. Now, drawing back on Dr. Newland's GTCS annual lecture this year, again, she talks about living on the edge of chaos. Now, as I record this towards the middle end of March 2022, we are witnessing the war of Russia on Ukraine. As a world, we are living in precarious times, in conflict and their consequences, but also in areas of climate threat. Now, some of you might be alarmed to say, I'm suggesting you have to be more political. After all, should our position as educators not be to be neutral, and that to be professional, we have to demonstrate some kind of professional detachment so that we don't engage in bias, particularly negative bias. And also, we're mindful that in a neighboring country like in England in February 2022, political impartiality guidance was issued to schools for teachers. Now, I'm not talking here about you going out to indoctrinate learners or influencing political beliefs of pupils that you teach. What I'm suggesting here is that having political nous means not being apolitical. In other words, having an interest in political issues and not just disengaging with it. Of course, we understand that education is not a neutral exercise. And it's having an interest in understanding the wider world, why things happen, and thinking about what an anti-oppressive world might look like. Developing our social justice literacy, understanding why injustices occur. We understand things that are unjust occurs, but why are they occurring? And that they're also contemporary. When I do race work, a lot of people often talk about apartheid South Africa or the southern states of the US, but actually it's the here and now, it's the contemporary. So having that nous to understand all these things and understanding revisiting the purpose of education. Is it for transformation or domestication, as Paulo Freire would say? Is it about maintaining the status quo, but hoping for a better tomorrow? And that teaching is a profession of hope. Now, I would urge teachers in Scotland not to feel that they must always refrain from sharing their personal views with their pupils. Sharing your views is not synonymous with indoctrination. You're not requiring your pupils to share your belief. You are just sharing yours with them. Now, of course, you will engage with degrees of nous and discretion in doing so. But research has shown us that what pupils do not wish is to be pressurized to think in particular ways, but they are interested and curious to know what we, as their teachers, think about different issues. And I fully understand that you and I are operating within rules and regulations from our employers that might restrict what we do. However, I would suggest to you that if we want our pupils to think critically, then we need to introduce to them that adults also have individual and differing viewpoints. Again, having worked for decades with thousands of student teachers, but also with qualified teachers, I still find that there are colleagues who are disinterested in politics and appear to have an unproblematic understanding of concepts like social justice and equality. I can still hear my one student teacher telling me that she treats everyone the same from the minute they come into her classroom, but that she has no power to do anything about what happens elsewhere. Now, the fact that this particular student, I'm glad she didn't think like that by the time she left, that's our job as educators, but by having that thought, she assumed that all the pupils were coming with a clean, starting from the same place. And we know that that is not the case. So we have to not be naive and ignorant, but to have political nous. Sonia Nito suggests that social justice work is political work. And therefore, from the teaching that we do in our classroom to the infrastructures we work in, from disciplinary policies to recruitment and selection, it is about who is heard, who's not heard. And she asks, who can paint the picture and who gets left behind? So it's all political work. Siobhan Collingwood, a head teacher in Morecambe Bay Community Primary School in Lancashire, co-wrote a chapter with Sheila Lang, who some of you may know, who was then head teacher at Preston Pans Infant School in East Lothian. They titled their chapter Facing the Challenge of Child Poverty. And they wrote that chapter for a book I co-edited with my late colleague Terry Wrigley, who I miss dearly, and former colleague Lynn Pratt, a book called Social Justice Re-examined. And they wrote that the core purpose, often when teachers are asked what their role is, to say it is about helping pupils reach their full potential. But however, Collingwood suggests, it is about creating the conditions, the necessary conditions for children around young people to reach a point of self-actualization so that they can be what they can be. Sheila Lang, writing in that same chapter and having worked in many schools in multiple deprivation, talked about the need to work with pupils and families with respect and recognition at a personal, cultural level, and to seek structural change at the same time. Because in working in an area of poverty, you couldn't just work with a micro level. You had to understand the impact of poor housing, the lack of transport, loss of benefits, etc., on the lives of the pupils. So actually engaging with that structural is important. There's a socio-political context of the lives of those young people. And therefore, she would suggest being political is part of our ethical framework of teachers who care about our learners, who care also about ourselves and our workplaces and our rights and our working conditions. So in suggesting teachers need to be political, I come to my third and final provocation, that to engage in culturally responsive teaching, we must also pay due regard to developing greater capacities for critical ethical reasoning. Now, I know this is a session about ethical frameworks, but I do think we need to go back and say, well, what do we mean when we talk about culturally responsive teaching? Well, the term culturally responsive pedagogy was really the concept that was coined by Gladstone Billings in 1995. And she talked about 3 goals when we're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy. We must teach in a way that expects pupils to have academic success. And it's therefore an asset-based rather than a deficit approach. Teaching that develops positive identities. Now, in Gladstone Billings was talking really about African-American learners at that point. So the identity of their ethnicity and the culture that they come from, that the pupils are coming from. And teaching that supports pupil abilities to recognize, understand, and critique social inequalities. So it was these 3 goals, and they all had to happen. It wasn't one or the other. Now, within our Scottish context, I think we can broaden that and take the above 3 goals and apply to other protected characteristics in our groups. So to expect pupil academic success of every single one of our pupils, and to teach in a way that develops those pupils' positive identities, particularly if they come from minoritized and disadvantaged backgrounds, and supporting them to understand the why. Remember, I said earlier that injustices occur, but actually understanding why is really important. And I think this all forms part of our personal and professional competence. Now, building on that work, Geneva Gay used the term culturally responsive teaching, and she talked about it as drawing from the cultural knowledge, experiences, frames of reference, performance styles, and again referring to African-American, in this instance, ethnically diverse students, to make learning outcomes more relevant to and effective for these pupils. Now, I mentioned Siobhan Collingwood and Sheila Ling's work earlier, and this is the approach that they use. So in developing a model of care, what they did was developed a command and competence and understanding of the cultural metaphors of the pupils, the families and communities they came from, the rituals and social structures that were part of the lives of their pupils. And they took this into account in terms of how they developed their teaching practice, but also how they allocated school resources. So Ling, for example, recognized that for a lot of the pupils, they didn't really necessarily have an adult present in the house that would bring them to school on time or explain what a curriculum for excellence meant and how to assist in the future of subject choices and so forth. So she developed a family liaison teacher role, and sometimes this teacher would go to the family's house to bring the children to school, and it would generally come to breakfast club. So understanding the social structures and the demands and constraints and the barriers meant that they were bringing that knowledge to how they actually taught. And that for them was culturally responsive teaching. I also remember Sheila Ling talking about the fact that her pupils lived in such multiple deprivation that for them, they often didn't even have the time or the ability to go 1 mile along the road, let alone into the city of Edinburgh, for example, to experience something different. And yet she wanted to bring the world, the international world, to these pupils. And she knew that things like school trips abroad were just a non-starter. So she started to change the curriculum and created ways to actually bring the world to her pupils and making that real. In the example that she quoted to me in the school and the staff team developed there was in the area of connecting with refugee camps in the northern border of Thailand and thinking about the issues in Burma. She talked about Aung San Suu Kyi being under house arrest, etc. And some of her pupils said, oh, I know about being in prison. My dad's in prison. And the links were starting to be created about issues of loneliness, about issues of confinement, about issues of poverty, about issues of escaping from an abusive home, abusive situation, as in the case of refugees. Now, what I also remember and stay in my mind is I did some of that research with her just before summer break, and seeing pupils cry when they realized summer was coming and there would be no school. Because school was a safe place. School was a place you'd get a hot meal. School was a place you'd get an adult that you could speak to and protect you. Now, Collingwood and Laing are not unique. There will be many of you listening that do similar, and I applaud you. And what you're doing is engaging in moral, ethical practice that demonstrates respect and appreciation for cultural diversity, weaving in empathy and understanding, but also being responsive to the circumstances you find yourself in. Culturally responsive teaching, therefore, rejects deficit-oriented teaching methods, which places those who are in minorities, perhaps who have English as an additional language, people with additional support needs, as having barriers to learning. You know, many pupils who are in minority groups are so resourceful. They're strategic negotiators of their situations. They code, switch, and change far, far more than we realize that they're doing. So they rejects the deficit-oriented teaching approach and adopts an asset-based approach, drawing on pupils as sources of knowledge. So culturally responsive teaching is the nexus of the what we do in the classroom and in our schools, the how we do it, but also the why we do it. Focusing, for the majority of teachers, we focus on the here and now, and that is absolutely right. And so we have to engage with the immediacy in front of us. And in so doing, I think we do need to think about developing critical ethical reasoning capacities, because often some of these dilemmas, the equality type related dilemmas, are in front of us in the here and now. So critical ethical reasoning is how we respond to ethical dilemmas. Now, Shapiro-Leszczynski suggests that there are two ways we do that. And I find this quite useful, these two central components. One is something she calls the morality of justice, which is where we think about issues of rights and obligations. So the right of the child to have, the pupil to have good education, and the teacher's obligation to provide it. But in the area of equality, etc., there's also human rights and equality legislation policy that guide us. And then she says the other component is the morality of care. And in that, she talks about having education caring frameworks, safeguarding frameworks, so forth, but also the relationship with our individual learners and the duty of care we have to each learner. Now, the morality of justice is very political because that's the macro part. The morality of care bit tends to be at a more micro level. And neither of these approaches are more important. Both are needed, I think, to address critical incidents. One of the many things that faces us, of course, is the tension that often arises between these. We find ourselves in the demands, and so that's when our moral compass and our internal governance starts kicking in, our political nous starts kicking in, our ethical frameworks start kicking in. But even then, it can be quite demanding of us. So let me give you a couple of examples. So the first one is one that I call school values versus family beliefs. So in one of the sessions I did a few years ago, an early years educator asked in a CPD session, I talked about a situation she had faced where child A's parents had come into the early years provision and said, I don't want my child A, to sit next to child B because we're of a different caste. So these are both Asian children, Asian parents, and it was on the issue of caste differences. She wanted to know what I thought about it, and I turned it back on her and said, well, what did you think about it? And she said that she felt it was wrong, it was discriminatory, and school was an inclusive school, and the two little ones were friends in any case. So here's an example of a tension between the morality of care to the little ones, but also being mindful of parental rights, but also the morality of justice, which is about understanding the equality legislation and the local authority equality policies. And the Equality 2010 Act does not specifically mention caste, but there is case law that says that caste discrimination is illegal and therefore is protected. The UN Human Rights Council also sees caste discrimination as a violation of human rights. So this is where your morality of justice framework and component kicks in. The upshot was that this member of staff took the issue to the head teacher, who of course supported them, and the school did not adhere to the parents' request. The parent threatened to remove the child from the school and put them in another early years center. They were told, you're welcome to do so, but the same principles would apply. This, I would suggest, needs to be part of our professional competence, and it's relevant to us to be able to actually, and regardless of the age group we're in, to actually think on our feet in this. So in this instance, I think this member of staff did draw on her intuition of fairness, but she needed the backing and the political nous of knowing about her rights and obligations under law to understand that she had the ability to move forward with what she then decided. The person who asked me that question was also not sure about, while she was almost convinced that her line manager would support her, she wasn't entirely sure because of the parental rights issue. So she was seeking affirmation about the route map for the rules and regulations, but also to have an understanding of what her responsibilities might be. Now, I think it's really important that we're not deterred by our lack of confidence to do the right thing. And here's another example, a school trip for 5th and 6th years. And suddenly you find that actually somebody's managed to sneak in a couple of bottles of vodka to this residential trip. When confronted, nobody is willing to report who brought the vodka in. So you have a situation of the morality of justice. So, what does the rules say? Local authority guidelines and residential trips away, versus the caring for those pupils. Is this just youthful folly? Do you engage in sensitive supervision? But what about the issue of underage drinking? That cannot be overlooked. So, and because nobody has spoken up, you can't do individual sanction. So do you do collective sanction? In this instance, the teachers cancelled the rest of the trip. They went home on the basis that the pupils had signed a contract to say that they would not misbehave, they would not engage in vandalism or poor behavior, etc. And the issue was reported to the pupils, parents, guardians, and because no one spoke up, a collective sanction was imposed, and future extracurricular activities for this particular group, for this particular year, was cancelled. It'd be interesting to hear your views and your thinking of both these ethical dilemmas that I have just posed. In order for us to be ethical professionals, I do think we do need to be mindful of these both parts of the morality of justice and the morality of care. But we need to also be mindful we have particular orientations. Some of us would move more towards the care side, almost putting the justice bit to the rights and obligations bit a little bit inconsequential. Others will be very much into morality of justice and lesser so in the morality of care. And yet we know that an integrated approach has to be the way forward, but we're not really trained to balance these two factors. And then you throw in issues of equality and diversity and the tensions and the value conflicts that come in with that. I do think that these all need to be part of our ethical framework as we move forward. So in conclusion, I offered 3 provocations: the need for teachers to consider positionality and for us to think about how this impacts on our thinking and practice. The second is a call to have more political nous and not be apolitical when we think about issues of ethical framework. And the third is sharpening critical ethical reasoning skills as we develop culturally responsive teaching. As we move forward, I want to remind ourselves again that teaching is a profession of hope. It involves the formation of each new generation into the citizens of tomorrow, for a world that is not yet known. But what we do know is what we do in the classroom today, what we do in our schools and our early years and our colleges today will help to shape that tomorrow. It is about reminding ourselves again that education is not a neutral exercise. The fact that something is normal or standard practice, officially sanctioned, does not make it right. Those policymakers who speak in terms of delivering a ready-made package of knowledge distort the reality of teaching and learning and undermines the ethics of a teaching profession. Dr. Kevin Kumashiro, who is formerly Dean of the School of Education in San Francisco, suggests that it's unethical to approach teaching and learning in ways that are comfortable, confirming, acritical, and reassuring. He goes on to suggest that if we do not engage in learning that disrupts us, but also those we teach, then we are supporting the status quo and not recognizing and challenging the oppression and the inequalities that play out daily in our lives. Given international pressures for schools to become increasingly efficient in serving economic interests, it is vital for us as we move forward in thinking about ethical frameworks and professional standards to hold on to a broad vision of education as community, enlightenment, empowerment, as well as a passion for lifelong learning as part of our deliberations. Thank you.